Having car problems? Well, with Rhoda, getting them fixed is as easy as ordering takeout. They'll come pick up your car for free, do any repair or maintenance needed, and return it right to your driveway. They'll even give you a complimentary video inspection of your car so you can see what needs to be done. Perfect for those of us that maybe aren't so car savvy. Book your appointment online at roda.com. And lucky for you, CityCast listeners get a 20% discount on any service for up to $100 off. Just use the code CityCast20. This week, DC's police union called for the city's violence intervention programs to be shut down after Ward 8 council member Trayon White was charged with bribery related to one of these programs. So today on CityCast DC, I'm here with Dr. Joseph Richardson, a UMD professor and co-chair of DC's Homicide Review, to talk about what exactly DC's violence interrupters do for the city. Today's Wednesday, September 18th. I'm Bridget Todd, and here's what DC is talking about. Dr. Richardson, thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, as you probably know, violence intervention programs have really been a topic of conversation lately because of the Trayon White arrest. For folks who need a recap, White has been accused of accepting bribes to give favorable violence intervention program contracts to folks. So, for folks who might not know, what exactly is a violence intervention program and why does DC need them?
So violence intervention programs have been around for well over, 2 to 3 decades. They are alternatives to law enforcement and are a critical feature of public safety and usually involve people who have shared and lived experiences living in communities that have been disproportionately impacted by violence. And they're often individuals that have been impacted by violence, whether they were involved as a perpetrator or a survivor or both, and which makes them quite credible in terms of intervening in violence. And so they're trained in conflict mediation, conflict resolution, often trained in cognitive behavioral therapy, which they include in their street outreach. So you can imagine someone actually providing therapy for someone on a corner while they're in the community. And their jobs are to prevent gun violence before it actually happens. And so they are intervening in the line of fire. And unfortunately, their jobs are very dangerous, quite hazardous. We have had violence interrupters who have actually lost their lives intervening in conflict. And so they play an important role. We're finding in many of our studies that violence intervention programs in cities such as Baltimore, where they've been in communities for up to 3 to 5 years, that we're seeing, significant results in terms of reduction in shootings. DC, unlike many other cities, has 2 community violence intervention programs. One program is Cure the Streets, which is under the DC Office of the Attorney General, and that uses the global cure model, which is pretty much the standard model for street outreach. And then they also have, which has been part of this situation with Trayon White, we also have the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. And then there are, I believe, 27 sites under ONES, which is the acronym for Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. And they have the discretion to use their own model. So you have kind of 2 competing models in the city.
How important is establishing those trust relationships on the ground to having these programs actually be something that's effective? In hearing and reading about your work, I understand that it involves public health, social work, social science, therapy, but also that on the ground trust building work. What does this work actually look like, and what role does that trust building actually have in it?
I mean, the work looks different person to person, group to group, block to block, neighborhood to neighborhood. But at the end of the day, you must have the trust, building the trust in order to have people buy into that your approach and your word and the ability for that person to provide resources to individuals when they say they're going to and commit to their promises is critically important. And so in Washington, D.C., as well as in other cities, typically violence interrupters are from the communities that they serve. And that's for an important reason. I mean, you need to have credibility in a community where you work. And so they're often recruited, young men and women recruited from the neighborhoods where they actually engage in CVI work. I think at the crux of it all, it comes down to building that trust and rapport, which is why we're seeing in other cities where CVI sites are well established for 3 to 5 years. That's why we're seeing a return on our investment, because that level of trust and rapport is beginning to pay off.
Yeah, I wonder, putting this in context of DC specifically, I don't think I need to tell you that DC, particularly in 2023, had a problem with violent crime. Now, to be clear, it seems like that is normalizing some, which is great. But I
Right.
wonder, for these city programs that are looking to combat gun violence, what do you think was not working in 2023 when it comes to those programs? Like, someone looking at the homicide and gun violence rate in DC in 2023 might listen to what you just said about these programs having a return on investment and be like, where are these programs working for the city?
Well, there are always going to be outliers, right? So DC wasn't the only city in the United States where violence was trending upward and other cities were trending downward. So you're going to have some of your cities that are outliers. I wouldn't necessarily lay that all on the hands and at the feet of CVI programs. I mean, we can spread around the accountability for that. We can
Fair.
spread that around to law enforcement, prosecutor's office. We also had a discredited forensic lab, right, which we were farming out our forensic lab work to other labs. So there are a lot of different agencies and people who could be accountable for why we had such a huge increase. And I just want to make a point of that, because when things go wrong, we tend to point our fingers about regarding, what's the newest program that should take responsibility for it. And it's easy to point the finger and blame CVI, but we've had, law enforcement around for decades and centuries, right? And so we need to share the level of accountability, and that goes from across our attorney general's office to our crime lab, right, to even our schools. So it's the amount of investment that we place into all of those agencies that make up our CVI ecosystem. And so I would say, that did happen. We had 274 homicides in 2023, but we're also trending back down to the norm
Right.
right now. I think today we're down 31% from where we were last year. But there a lot of this has to also do with leadership as well. I mean, we've had multiple changes in leadership under the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. So we could point to a lot of things. And then the last thing I would say is you really need to have the belief and commitment by city administrators. And I'm going to say, put this, bluntly, you need to have the commitment by the mayor's office. And quite frankly, her proposal to slash the budget for community violence intervention by 54%, I think how much people are invested depending on where they put their money, where their mouth is. And clearly, her lack of investment shows that she's really not supportive of violence intervention, street outreach efforts in the district. So I would say that in terms of sustainability of the programs, and to have a very kind of coherent community violence intervention strategy and plan, which the district has always, since I've been working in the district, has always had its fits and starts in terms of adhering to a plan. We may go for a year adhering to a plan. There may be a high profile homicide case that comes up, or a series of homicides, and then the mayor will pivot, create an entirely new program,
Mm.
And then that program, for whatever reason, due to lack of leadership, lack of coordination, which the DC suffers from in terms of being very resource rich, but in coordination poor, that program will never seem to effectively get off the ground. So I'll say for other cities that have seen successes, for example, you're seeing a significant drop in homicides in Baltimore. We were to use that comparatively as our, sister city, which is, 40, 45 miles up the road. They're seeing significant drops in homicides. And I think one of the reasons why is that despite some of the bumps and bruises that they may have taken on through times where there were high rates of homicides, where they had 10 years of homicides over 300 since the death of Freddie Gray, they've stuck to their CVI strategy. And now I think it's beginning to pay off.
It sounds like you're saying there's a lot of important pieces that are needed for a program like this to be effective, but ultimately you need to understand that it's going to take time. You need to have that buy-in from different, city services that are working together in a way that is actually going to be effective. And it honestly sounds like you need a mayor who is really putting the time and intention and the follow-through in these programs for them to actually be effective. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying. You need the mayor, the deputy director of public safety, and then also what is the role of the Office of Gun Violence Prevention, which I would assume that would be the czar of gun violence prevention efforts in the city, right? And so here we have an Office of Gun Violence Prevention, but they really don't play a critical role in developing, implementing, and ensuring that the CVI strategy for the city is carried out, right? So we have to question what's the function of that office, right? Again, and that comes down to the mayor. How does the mayor envision the CVI strategy? We've had discussions again about whether there should be a merger between the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement and Cure the Streets, which is under OAG. There's been discussions about that. And then, just in terms of job security, right? And this is by no means excusing what happened in the case with Councilmember White. But we have to also acknowledge that these contracts in the CVI space are up for renewal every year. So people are very unsure about whether they'll have a job the next year, which opens the door for corruption. Right? How much pressure is it when you're hiring people from the community to keep your doors open and to keep your agency afloat when every year your job is up for renewal? So imagine, and I'm just going to put this in practical terms for anyone listening. Imagine you working at your job and every single year your job was up for renewal. If this were a council member and this was something that was tied in the DC Police Department, I don't think we would be calling for us to, defund the police.
Let's be real, lawsuits are not fun, but with Paulson & Nace, at least they're a little easier. Paulson & Nace is a DC law firm in every sense of the word. It was founded here in 1979. Partner Chris Nace is a local who cares deeply about the DC community, even serving on the board of the local branch of the Living Classrooms Foundation in his free time. Nace and his associates Samantha Peters and Maya Perry handle medical malpractice, wrongful death, and other complex injury cases. And they don't just settle every case. They'll go to court. They'll fight for you. Paulson & Nace has even been recognized as one of U.S. News' best law firms. So if you have been hurt or lost a loved one because of someone else's mistake or negligence, call Paulson & Nace for a no-obligation consultation. Visit www.paulsonandnace.com. That's PAULSONANDNACE.com. Or call 202-463-1999. So lately, the weather in DC has been downright wacky sometimes. Tornadoes, crazy flooding, bad air quality, so much of it feels out of control. But I recently learned that September is National Preparedness Month, and it is a good reminder to make your emergency plan if you haven't yet. The yearly preparedness campaign was started by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, and they have a bunch of tips on their website to get you started. It's ready.dc.gov/NPM2024. One of the best ways to prepare is to make sure you have a way of staying informed, not just by listening to CityCast DC. Sign up for free email or text alerts from district officials on weather, traffic, public safety, and more by visiting alert.dc.gov. Another tip, build your emergency kit over time. Purchase one extra item each time you shop. A checklist is available at ready.dc.gov/kit. Take time now to prepare because later is too late. Everything you need is at ready.dc.gov.
So I would say, as someone who has just covered this, like any other resident in DC, reading about it in the news and all of that, are there things that you think the average person in DC does not know about violence in DC that, like, perhaps the media is not covering properly? What story do you wish the media was telling about gun violence in DC that folks maybe aren't getting?
I think one, that the people who are engaged in the work, many are really committed, and you would have to be because you're making $50,000 a year and there's no likelihood of getting a raise. That doesn't exist. There's no hazard pay. There's no overtime, despite violence intervention workers engaged in street outreach pretty much are on call 24 hours a day. Like, their phones are always on. They could be called to a scene at any given time. They could be at home. Something could happen in the street. They immediately get a call. And so they're getting no overtime pay, no hazard pay, right? They're living in a city which is one of the most rapidly gentrifying and most expensive cities in the United States, and they don't have a sustainable wage. And so again, here you're asking people to step into the line of fire and sacrifice their lives, but look how much money they're making. And if we were to compare that, to a public safety strategy, whether they're police officers or firemen, violence interrupters are putting out fires every day. So these are things that people need to know, because there's no union for CVI workers, right? You just can't go to a union and file a complaint, right? These are all things that we need to acknowledge that's missing just in terms of equity in the CVI space. And so I really want people to understand that, you have a field where, for the most part, people are underpaid and undervalued. And just in terms of scale, look at the budget of the police department compared to the budget of CVI. It's just totally out of scale to me. So these are all things that people need to understand, and that the return of investment is not going to happen overnight. You're just not going to magically wave a wand and suddenly the crime rate just disappears. It takes investment, commitment, and support. And it takes the leadership, which we haven't seen that in CVI and DC. It's been very fragmented and disjointed.
Well, it also goes back to what we started our conversation talking about, which is the importance of trust, the importance of understanding relationships and relationship building, and then just being on the ground. And it sounds like the added thing to this is, like, sometimes being on the ground is actually the ground, and sometimes it's digital, it's virtual, it's social media.
Exactly. So we're moving between, a virtual space and a physical space. Like, we move between a digital street and a physical street. And we have to acknowledge that that's the world that we live in now. And our traditional approaches to CVI, which are 30 years old, have to evolve and change to account for what's really happening outside and inside, if you consider a virtual space. So those are also changes that need to, be reflected and acknowledged by those who are critics of CVI, because clearly the prosecutor's office and DC MPD, they use a lot of social media to prosecute cases, right? I'm sure they have training in it now. They're very prepared to engage social media in order to gather evidence to support their cases. But we need to make the same level of investment in training and resources for CVI. And then the last thing I would say, some CVI programs in the city are being more creative too, by placing CVI workers in the schools and getting ahead of that. So there's not just, law enforcement or SRO officer in the schools. There are also, CBI workers that can, again, get ahead of these issues that might flow not only bi-directionally, but I would say tri-directionally. They flow from the school to the street to the digital space. And they're able to get ahead of that by being in schools. So all of those things are important in terms of, how we address these issues. As one of the investigators assigned to evaluate CBI in DC, my colleague Diane Webster and I, through Arnold Ventures, are evaluating DC CBI over the next 3 to 4 years. And I'm leading the qualitative component. It's important that we also uplift the stories and the narratives coming from CBI workers, because we can get really caught up in, just what the numbers are saying. But there's a context behind that. And those voices and those narratives need to be heard just as much as we need to know the numbers behind what's happening.
Well, Dr. Richardson, thank you for your work. Thank you for being here today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
After this interview with Dr. Richardson, we reached out to the mayor's office for comment on how Mayor Bowser views and approaches violence interruption programs in DC. But we never heard back. That's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with even more news around the city. Talk to you then.